Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a mouse in graphite. Now my main goal for this project was to show how to capture a high level of realism when working on a smaller scale. Now although the entire paper size was 4 by 6, this mouse was only 3 inches tall and 2 inches wide, so I'm trying to capture a lot of detail in a smaller area. Now when I'm aiming for a high level of realism, regardless of the size that I'm working on, I'm always focusing on 3 main things. That's the layering process, the contrast, and the pencil technique. Now I like to work on smaller projects like this because I feel it really enables us to refine that pencil technique. We have to be more delicate with how much pressure we apply to the pencil, how we move the pencil. The layering process needs to be correct in order to still capture the right depth and values. Now this is really important and we can transfer this to larger projects. The other reason I like to work on small pieces like this is because it breaks up that routine. If we always work on larger projects or complex projects, we can get burnt out really quickly. So occasionally fitting in a smaller project like this with still a high level of realism, it helps to break up what we're drawing at the easel and can keep us motivated. This is a real big factor when drawing and being creative. If I can keep that motivation there and prevent that feeling of burning out, we're able to be far more productive in how we work. Now when I worked on the fur of this is where the pencil technique becomes really important. And I'm not changing any of my techniques from what I would use on a larger project. I'm starting off with my graphite powder layer here and I'm using a paper blending stump to apply that. Now this graphite powder layer, exactly if I was working on a larger scale, is there just to map in my main lights and darks. I'm not using this to get my base layer as dark as what the final piece is going to be. You can see from that photo of the drawing in the corner how much darker all of my values are, and that's all achieved with the pencils. But having that graphite powder layer in provides that initial layer of softness, which I love at my first base foundation. Now when I do start working with the pencil technique, because the face of this is barely an inch, I need to be making sure that I'm using the right pressure, how I'm holding and moving the pencil. Now there is a lot of detail that I'm going to be capturing here, and that's because there are factors such as how sharp the lead should be, the pressure that's applied, and as I said, how we're holding that pencil as well. But it's the layering process. You can see that despite it being quite small here, I'm not just jumping into my darkest values. I'm still building up the layering process in stages. Now a moment ago you saw that I used an eraser to pull in some of my highlights. Now this is something where I will incorporate highlights at different stages depending on the fur texture that I'm drawing. But one of the things that is important is the eraser technique, and that's just as crucial as the pencil technique. I want those highlights to be looking the same as my pencil details, so I don't want my erasers to create those thicker lines. I want to be making sure that I'm still replicating the right texture for the highlights. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in the step-by-step real-time versions. All of the information to those tutorials are in the description below. And because those real-time tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. This makes even the more complex subjects far easier to tackle. So now I've got more of the face drawn in, you can really see how the pencil technique has helped to establish the correct fur direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now when working on a smaller scale like this, it's really important to capture those main changes in fur direction because that will help to give shape and form to the animal that we're drawing. Now it isn't just the fur direction that helps to give shape and form to a drawing, it's also the contrast. Now contrast is something that I focus on with any drawing that I'm working on. I want my darks to be nice and dark and I want the highlights to be nice and bright. Now it doesn't matter if we've got thousands of pencil strokes within the drawing, if the contrast isn't right, those details are not going to look as realistic. So you can see here how I'm building up those darker values in the ear. It's going to really help to create more of that three-dimensional look. I want it to have that appearance like this mouse is just going to come straight off of the paper. In order to do that, I have to make sure that I've got my values right. Now a big aspect of my real-time tutorials that I do focus on is how to make the use of the erasers over dark layers of graphite. This is something that I get a lot of questions about, so I do like to make sure I cover this thoroughly in every single one of those lessons. Being able to make sure that we have that confidence to put in our highlighted details over the top of such dark layers of graphite can really make a big difference to how realistic the end portrait is going to look. Now there are of course many ways to get to the same end, so you can draw around your highlights, you can use an indenting method, but I personally feel that that gives a bit more of a harshness to those highlights. The way that I visualise fur, it's that the highlights are on the very top of those darker layers, they're catching more of that light. So for me, I like to be able to add those in over the top. Now being able to use those right techniques with the erasers is all starting with how the graphite is applied. If the graphite is applied in an incorrect way, those erasers are going to have a much harder job to remove that graphite. This is why I do focus on the layering process so much in all of the tutorials. Now onto the body, and I'm using my graphite powder again. This is something that I will feature in every single one of my graphite drawings, but when I'm working with fur that's out of focus like this, I just find the graphite powder is invaluable. It gives a real softness, that blurry effect very quickly, even with that first layer stage. Now of course I wouldn't leave it like this. I do want to be making sure that I come in and hint at more of that fur texture. But when working on out of focus elements, it's important not to add too many details. Now you're bound to have areas that look more blurry compared to others, and in those situations you want to use less pencil strokes. There are of course instances where it's so blurry that the graphite powder is enough to create that effect. You don't need to go back in with your pencils if you feel you don't need to. But on the right hand side there was more details on this mouse's body compared to the left, so now I'm coming back in here and hinting at more of that fur texture. Now this is where I need to focus again on the pencil technique, and this time the fur length. Now the fur length is determined by how long those pencil strokes are. Now the fur here on the body is longer than it is on the face, so I might even just have to extend my pencil strokes by a millimetre or two. But having that variation in is going to help with more of that realism when the portrait is finished. I don't want the fur to look the same length on the face and the body, because of course that's not going to be how it is in real life. I want to be making sure that I've always focused on the three main factors with pencil technique. That's fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now I've briefly mentioned the thickness of the eraser details, and that is of course the same with the pencils. This is something I do focus the real-time tutorials on as well, because that's going to be determined by how sharp your pencil is and how much pressure you're applying to your pencil. Now even how you move your graphite pencil can affect how sharp or how fine your details look. So because I did want the fur texture here to be soft with that out of focus effect, if my details were really thin and more defined than what I've got now, then that fur is going to look more in focus like the face. So being able to adjust the pencil technique here makes a really big difference. Now one way that I personally find helps to capture more detail in my drawings is I do like to work in smaller sections. So although, as I said, this mouse is only 3 inches tall, I want to be making sure that I'm still breaking up into small sections. I've only focused on the face, then I did the ears and now the body. But the body's been broken up into 3 sections. I did the right side, I then did the middle and then the left. This is just making sure that no one part of the drawing is rushed where I'm starting to become overwhelmed. If we look at the reference photo and we're trying to absorb all of that information for one whole layer, I personally find that I start to rush. So to make sure that I don't do that, because that does mean we'll end up skipping layers and the depth is going to be impacted, I want to be focusing on each tiny area, get that to about 80-90% complete, and then I can move on. Now of course, if you are an artist who likes to work in whole individual layers, that is not a problem at all. Each artist is going to have their own way that they like to work. But if you do find that you're staring at your reference photo, not quite sure of where you should be, you're spending more of that time hesitating, then that is an indication that we're working on too much of a larger area. Now the feet of this mouse are a prime example of that for me. If I tried to draw all of this at the same time and do all of the feet for one layer and then the next layer and so on, I know that the toes are going to start to take on an incorrect shape. Now because the feet here were so tiny, I had to make sure that the lights and darks were very accurate. If they shifted even just a little bit, the toes and the feet are going to completely change shape. So I do want to be making sure that I was able to focus on one bit at a time, 1 foot at a time, and make sure that I wasn't ever skipping any of those layers. Because the feet were out of focus, I wasn't able to create that realism with detail. Going back to what I mentioned before, it's all in the values. I'm coming back in with my pencils and using lighter pressure here to just darken very slightly some of those midtones. I don't want there to be any sharp dark shadows on the feet to pull focus to that, because that will give the impression that they're more in focus, but I want to be making sure that I've got the shape and the toes accurate from the very beginning, because otherwise it can be easy to start to rush through, and if the feet of this weren't right, it can be really distracting to the entire drawing. And in order to make sure that the mouse wasn't floating, I just put in a little shadow here under the feet just to help ground it to the paper. You could of course do a little bit of grass, whichever is your preferred effect would be okay, but just leaving it floating is something that I don't ever like to do. I always want to have something there that's going to help merge that to the paper. Now, one of the very last aspects of any of my drawings is adding the whiskers. Now, the whiskers overlap everything else, so I do like to leave those until the very last layer. If the whiskers are drawn in too soon, then we end up having to draw around them if the fur underneath is not finished. So that just is far more fiddly and more time consuming. I will then just take a step back from my easel, have a look and see if there are any adjustments to the contrast, those lights and darks that are just going to pull in more of that three-dimensional feel to the drawing. So I really do hope that this video was useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this real-time tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that and my other lessons in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.